I spent the majority of the last 3 months working on a fairly large Rust project, and I made it my mission to use artificial intelligence as much as humanly possible during the course of working on this Rust project. My findings were interesting. I can't say that I came out of it feeling much more optimistic or honestly much more pessimistic about artificial intelligence, but I did learn a couple of things about what AI is good at for developers and what AI is bad at for developers. I'm going to kind of explain that throughout the course of this video. I'll be honest, going into this, I was not a big fan of artificial intelligence for developers, but I also was not exactly like a doomsdayer. Like, I kind of thought, there are going to be some good things about this and there are going to be some bad things about this. And what I found was that I was right, but I was right in ways that I was not particularly prepared for. So we've got our pros over here and we've got our cons over here. So in the pros, ChatGPT specifically is very good as a pseudo replacement for Google. So if you're looking to just search up questions, ChatGPT, in my opinion, is a good first step before you even get to Google. So a good, let's just say, thought triage. So this is like whenever you've got this idea in your head of how you want to do a thing, or when you've got this odd like syntactical bug that you're trying to work out, ChatGPT is a very good first stop with some caveats. Here's one of the biggest problems that I ran into when using ChatGPT specifically for Rust development. ChatGPT is not good for niche applications. So one of the things that I ran into during this contract was I had to do a lot of PDF parsing. And PDF parsing is something that's super common to have to do in languages like Python and, probably JavaScript as well. But in Rust, a lot of the libraries that are used for PDF parsing are either newer or aren't used as frequently. And the reason why I'm guessing that, and I say guess, but I'm almost fairly certain about it, is that ChatGPT was hallucinating constantly. Like, it was making up entire API endpoints, entire library calls that just straight up did not exist and did not exist in earlier versions of the library. They just straight up were complete hallucinations. It got entire data structures wrong. It got the fields on them wrong. It got the methods that were implemented with it wrong. Everything about it was wrong. And my guess is that this is because ChatGPT was trained on open source code. That is an incredibly controversial idea that tons of people have argued about. I'm probably about to record a video on that either tonight or tomorrow, a specific part of that. But ChatGPT was trained on a specific, set of code bases, a ton of different code. But if a certain library doesn't show up very frequently within that code base or within that set of code, then it doesn't know as much about that. So it can't create these guesses because that's what an LLM output is. It's just guesses based on fancy math, essentially. If it doesn't have a ton of experience dealing with those code bases, it's going to get a lot of things wrong. And that's exactly what happened. If you're dealing with smaller libraries or less popular libraries, you are going to be looking at tons of hallucinations. But that said, for your general use case, if I am looking for how do I iterate over this particular fairly common data type, it's very, very good at stuff like that. I would have to search through like one or two links in Google. I would have to like kind of look through, one or two Stack Overflow answers. This saves me a couple of seconds per Google search, which starts to add up, especially on a contract that I worked, a couple hundred hours on. So it is good for triaging easy questions that are likely to show up in a lot of code bases. It is not good for niche applications. Another thing that it is fairly good at is giving you structured answers. So, structured answers. Whereas in a Stack Overflow discussion, you'll have people who are like super annoying and are just like, I can't believe that you asked this question. You need to just go back and read the Rust book. You kind of have to like parse out the answer. With ChatGPT, it's much more straightforward. The way that it kind of answers questions is a lot more straightforward. which is honestly kind of nice. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. Now, you have to be careful of hallucinations, obviously, but pairing ChatGPT with like a good linter that is going to tell you like, hey, this function just straight up doesn't exist. And then you can go back to ChatGPT and literally tell it. Like there were several times that I told ChatGPT, you are hallucinating. And it was like, oh, sorry, here's another hallucination. Basically with ChatGPT, you just have to have a fairly decent knowledge of knowing like, okay, ChatGPT is not going to be able to help me with this because it's hallucinating everything. It clearly does not understand, this code base. It doesn't understand this library. So that's just kind of something that's just going to come with time. You learn how to Google, now you have to learn how to ChatGPT. We're going to move on past ChatGPT just a little bit to talk a little bit about Copilot. I used Copilot a good bit throughout the course of working on this contract. And honestly, I was surprised at how much I disliked it. Going into it, I thought in my head, this is going to help a ton with a lot of the annoying type of like creating structures and, populating fields and things like that. I didn't like it. It got in my way constantly. I constantly found myself hitting tab and auto completing a line of code that was either wrong or I just didn't actually want to auto complete it. And then I would have to erase it, and it just kind of like threw off my flow a ton. Like with, specifically with Copilot, I found myself constantly wrestling. So, wrestling with Copilot. It is good for filling out boilerplate code. If you want to create a structure based on some calls that you made, throughout your code base, like if you just go ahead and populate the calls that you want to make, and then you go over to your types file or whatever like that, and tell it to create the struct, it's okay at doing that. But the time saved there, to me at least, was dwarfed by the amount of time that I spent just wrestling with it, just like telling it, no, that's the incorrect way to, interpret what I'm wanting it to do. And then the way that you prompt it specifically was really annoying. Now, I don't want to be entirely unfair towards Copilot because in the middle of this project, I switched over to the new Helix IDE. That is like a Vim-like IDE that I really enjoy. I'm probably going to do a review of it fairly soon. But Helix does not yet, at the current time of recording, have a Copilot plugin. There's no like Copilot functionality within Helix. I looked, the devs for Helix seem fairly resistant to ever adding Copilot within Helix, which I'm fine with. But prior to that, I was using Vim, which already had, a plugin that you could use for Copilot. And honestly, I just spent so much time wrestling with it. When I switched over to Helix and found out that Helix doesn't have a Copilot plugin, I was kind of okay with it. The one thing that I will say is I'm keeping Copilot around and integrating it within VS Code, specifically for those instances where I have to generate a ton of boilerplate code. Specifically within TypeScript, it's kind of useful to be able to generate a lot of the types and interfaces and things like that fairly quickly. But I will say, one of the critiques that I do agree with after using Copilot a couple of times, or probably for a solid month of this 3-month contract, one of the things that I do agree with is that it does decrease your understanding of a code base, and I would say that's probably the biggest con in this experience that I've had. So it decreases understanding of code base. And I can say the same for ChatGPT, but honestly, it's mainly Copilot, because what I found with ChatGPT is I naturally started having conversations with ChatGPT to help explain the answers that it was giving me. With Copilot, it just spits out a code block and you integrate that within your code. And what I found when I had like a couple of hours of time to write some code and I used Copilot pretty heavily, what I found was when I looked back over my code, I understood it way less. Even though I told myself, okay, I'm going to only use this for boilerplate code generation, what I found was I actually was using it way more. I started to lean on it more and more. And this is somebody who's fairly resistant to artificial intelligence as a developer. I found myself leaning on it more and more, and that created a pretty negative impact on my understanding of my own code base, the code that I wrote. I ended up understanding less and kept having to go back and debug and find areas that I just did not quite grasp because the code was generated by somebody else. And the problem with that is like you'll say, well, on any given project, a lot of the code that you work on is going to be written by somebody else. That's entirely true. But if I work on a project with another developer and I don't understand a piece of code, I can ping them and ask them, hey, what does this do? And they'll explain it in a more or less human way, and they'll walk through it with me, and by the end of it I'll have a better understanding of their code, of my code, of everything. With Copilot, that's not the case. They're not going to explain it to you, and you could go to ChatGPT and literally have an interface between two AIs essentially with you as the middleman. But that just seems like a ton of work, honestly. And I found myself A, not doing that, and B, being really bummed out by my lack of understanding of my own code. I just wanted to turn it off. So at this point, I can see instances where I would turn Copilot on and generate some boilerplate code, generate some structs, some interfaces, things like that. I might use it for, okay, I've got this instance where I've got to iterate over a map of some sort, and I just don't feel like playing with the syntax to figure that out. Honestly, that doesn't really bother me all that much, but I can see instances where Copilot might be okay, and I could avoid a lot of those pitfalls. But honestly, I don't see myself turning Copilot back on very much. I think it's going to be a tool that I occasionally pull out of the toolbox and use, but altogether, I just don't like the impact that it had, the negative impact that it had on my code quality. Now, the biggest asterisk of them all, I'm not going to dump on people who use artificial intelligence within their code. I'm not going to say never use it. I'm also not going to say use it constantly. I'm going to say use it with caution, just like you would just about any other piece of code or any other tool within programming. Use it with caution. Understand that not everything is a nail and AI is not the perfect hammer. Approach artificial intelligence as another tool within your tool belt and don't lean on it too much. Otherwise, you will find that AI wrote your entire tool and you have no idea what it does, how to debug it. And debugging it is like 90% of being a developer. If you can't debug your own code, you're kind of screwed. So, another asterisk, that's all my opinion. If you have an alternate opinion, I'm perfectly fine with hashing that out in the comments. If you want to just completely drag me, I'm totally fine with that. You know where to find me. But I think this is a fairly reasonable middle of the road opinion. It's not really a hot take of any type. That's about it. Take it easy. Peace.